Hello, and welcome to the MethodSpace live webinar, Nurturing the Researchers of Tomorrow. Before we begin, which will be in about 9 minutes, hello, and welcome to the MethodSpace live webinar, Nurturing the Researchers of Tomorrow, hosted by our methods guru, Janet Salmons, with guests Trena Paulus, Nicola Pallitt, and Alice Barlow-Zambodla. So this is Michael Todd, and I'm the Social Science Communications Manager at Sage Publishing, and I'd like to begin by introducing our host. But before I do that, I want to mention that this 1-hour webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We will be sending out a link to view it and to access the slides to all registrants in the coming week. Now, our host today, as I mentioned, is our methods guru, Janet Salmons, methods guru at methodspace.com. Janet is an independent researcher, writer, and consultant through her company, Vision to Lead Incorporated. Janet, too, has written a number of books for Sage, including Doing Qualitative Research Online, Qualitative Online Interviews, and Online Interviews in Real Time. She previously served on the graduate faculty of the Capella University School of Business and was honored with the Harold Abel Distinguished Faculty Award for 2011 and 12 and the Stephen Shank Recognition for Teaching Award for 4 consecutive years. And I mentioned those books. There's going to be a discount code for one of Jan's books and for one of our panelists, Trina Paulus's book. Now, if any of you have any problem with the audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please use the Q&A box at the right of your screen, and one of our helpful team members will get back to you ASAP. And at the end of the scheduled presentations, we'll have time for Q&A from attendees, so please also use the Q&A box to ask any questions of our guests. And feel free to post questions throughout the webinar, not just during that session. You can do it while they're speaking, although we won't get to them until after the presentations, and we'll address them during the Q&A portion. And we also have a web Twitter hashtag, hashtag MethodSpaceLive. Feel free to ask questions or leave comments there. And if you don't mind, and a few of you have already done this, why not send us a message telling us where you're logging in from in our chat box. And without any further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Janet, who will introduce the webinar.
Hello and welcome everyone. This is Janet Salmons, and I'm just thrilled to be joined by this terrific global panel, and we'll have some interesting presentations, I think. We're going to begin, I'll just give a very quick overview of the topics we're talking about here today, and then Trina Paulus will talk about teaching, Nicola Pallitt will talk about supervising, Alice Barlow-Zambodla will talk about coaching, and then we'll have some Q&A. We want this to be an interactive session, and as Michael mentioned, we welcome you to post your questions. And if we don't get to your question during this webinar, we will post follow-up responses in the MethodSpace site. And as a reminder, you'll find other resources and related materials and posts in methodspace.com. So what we're talking about here today is, we're taking a very broad view of teaching, supervising, and coaching researchers, not only formal instruction in the classroom, but also looking at working with researchers who are out in the field. So I think that when we're trying to look at these, complex situations, and when we're thinking about developing new approaches or improving the status quo, taking a step back and looking at the big picture can help. So in this diagram, I've adapted Joseph Schwab's 1983 view of commonplaces just for this purpose. So Schwab was writing in the context of curriculum reform, but at the time, it was quite a radical approach to suggest that we not only collaborate and have kind of representative voices from all these different dimensions of the learning experience, but that we take into consideration the interplay of these 4 critical angles: the instructor, the students, the subject matter content, and the milieu. So as you listen to our panelists today, think about the implications as they relate to the content, the kinds of research methods and methodologies and theories and thinking and approaches we want to convey. The learning or the research setting, whether it's online, face-to-face, the ways that we work with students and novice researchers, either one-on-one or in a group, the kind of place the students are coming from. You know, what do they bring to this new understanding of research? Are they, do they have some prior experience or knowledge that will help them, or do they come at this, you know, from a kind of blank slate? And, you know, again, with either mentees or practicing researchers, you know, what is their prior experience that's either going to make it easy or perhaps more challenging to acquire some new perspectives? And then last but not least, for our own knowledge and skills development when we take the roles of instructors, supervisors, or mentors. And as we think about the content, you know, do we look at approaching it in a linear fashion or in a more holistic fashion? Yes, you know, we usually do design a study and we've got to get approval before we conduct it. So there certainly is, you know, a bit of a linear component to research. But when we're in the midst of a study, all of the elements come together, especially in interview or participatory approaches. We have to take a position, be ethical, stay true to the purpose, and ask questions and listen all at the same time. So how can we teach methods content to prepare students for actually designing and doing research, not just as another academic subject that might be workable in a step-by-step fashion? And as we think about our roles as mentors and research supervisors, whether in an academic setting or in a professional or field research setting, guiding researchers is a type of work that really uses every bit of our cognitive and affective capacities. And I've kind of placed these cognitive, what I would call cognitive side, in green and the affective side in blue. And I think, just based on my own experience, that no matter how much knowledge you have on that green side with the subject matter knowledge and research expertise, if you don't have this other side of being able to communicate, respect, and be generous with your time and knowledge with your mentees, then you'll have a difficult time motivating and supporting them. So let's see how our panel builds on these ideas and suggests others. And we'll start with Dr. Trena Paulus, and I'll just introduce her briefly before she starts. So Trina's research involves consulting in the use of digital tools for qualitative research, computer-mediated communication and social media, language-based analysis, and online and blended learning. She is currently the professor in the research division at the Department of Family Medicine at the East Tennessee State University's Quillen College of Medicine, and was previously professor of qualitative research at the University of Georgia. She's co-author of a new book, Looking for Insight, Transformation, and Learning in Online Talk, and she's the author of Digital Tools for Qualitative Research, with a new edition on the way. So we'll begin with Trina, and I'll introduce our other panelists as we go. So Trina.
Thank you so much, Janet, for the invitation to speak with you all today, and for Sage for hosting this. Yeah, I wanted to start with a little bit just to tell you about the context in which I've been engaged in teaching in the classroom. So as Janet mentioned, I have taught both at the University of Georgia and before that at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. My formal classroom teaching has been primarily in the United States, and that matters because when we're working with graduate students, which has been most of my experience, generally we have very coursework heavy graduate degrees, which I know is different from some other countries. So we do kind of have a luxury, quote unquote, of having students in the classroom. And we also have relatively small classes of mostly PhD and also some master students and some graduate certificate students. But we try to keep those classes around 15 to 20 students. But we might have students for which the course is required, and we might have some students who are taking research methods as an elective. I've taught across online, fully online courses, blended courses, and face-to-face environments. As Janet mentioned, I'm not going to talk about it much today, but I do really believe that digital tools for research matter and that they should be integrated in our teaching really from the first course on. I also typically see students, or the programs typically see students across more than one class. But what I want to talk about today is really kind of the core of what I think is really important for teaching qualitative methods. And that is that qualitative research is really a mindset. I see it at my job as sort of undoing what a lot of graduate students have learned is what they consider research. How we look at the world, how we define truth, our ways of being in the world are different when we're doing qualitative research. So what I try to do is go back to the anthropological and ethnographic roots of where qualitative research came from. Everyone learns about scientific objectivity and experimental design and the scientific method in middle school in the United States, but hardly anyone really knows much about qualitative research when they come to my class. Okay, we could go to the next slide. So I really try to organize the class around what I call fieldwork first. And this is actually a picture from Lesotho in Southern Africa, where I served as a Peace Corps volunteer for 2 years and learned a lot that I actually draw upon when I'm helping students do fieldwork. I think it's important for students to get out of their comfort zone and out of their own backyard. A lot of our students come to our classes heavily engaged in their own practice. They have a field. I teach interdisciplinary classes, but they usually have a very specific focus and research interest. But I really want to try to get students out of that particular interest into something that's completely foreign and different to them, so that they can have the experience of doing field work, and then they have something to hang my theoretical, epistemological, and literature review instruction on. Without actually having been in the field and challenging themselves, they have a hard time really understanding what qualitative research methodology and theory is. So that's my first focus. And then what I try to teach students too is that as they're doing the field work, there's really only two questions. The first is, what is happening here? And in order to understand what's happening here, I argue we have to go beyond qualitative research focus on interview studies and start with observations. How are people moving through the space? And also look at documents. How do documents construct what's happening in that space? So really looking at observations and document analysis first before we get to the interview. And I think that there's ways that we can structure this. And when I talk about getting out of your comfort zone, I'm not talking about going to another country or another town. It's something as simple as one student went to the farmer's market, for example, to really understand in depth what was happening here. The second question, we can go to the next slide, is what are the participants' experience of this venue that they're studying? So what I find a lot is that researchers go in with very focused research questions, right? Because that's what they're taught to do, is we need to know the research question. I would argue we don't always need to know the research question when we're trying to frame qualitative research. You want to know what's happening there and what is the experience of the people in this space. We are learners first, we're not evaluators. Now you might do an evaluation study someday, but in terms of teaching novice researchers, I try to get them away from judging what they're seeing to just learning from the people who are there. And the research questions will come, they will emerge, they will be participant focused. You don't know what's important to them, you only know what's important to you. So what I try to challenge students to do is to figure out what is important to the people who are living and working and being in that space that you're doing your field work in. Okay, so for the next slide, I thought I would just give some specific examples of the actual language I use with the students. So yeah, I generally am teaching semester-long classes and want them to spend time in the field, and I try to get them to choose a spot that is completely novel to them. Maybe they've never been to the farmers market, or Zumba was really popular for a while, so I had a student do field work at a Zumba class. I've had students do work in children's theater, all sorts of places. The goal is to, again, give you experience collecting and analyzing several types of data, and ideally those data would all come from the same location. Now, of course, you have to be flexible and tailor that. Sometimes that doesn't always work out, but that's the ideal. And I also try, and I do require that it be face-to-face. And I know that's sort of an anomaly given my area of research is online research, but I do think there's something to be learned to going face-to-face and sitting in that discomfort and that challenge to go and do that field work face-to-face. Okay. So I try to give them some ideas about where to go and not go, and I generally try to get them not to go to restaurants, bars, nightclubs, or other venues where food and drink are served for several reasons. It's hard to record in those environments. It's very noisy. If people are drinking, that's not necessarily safe. Now, if there is a legitimate reason, maybe they're students who are studying tourism and hospitality, I could work with them on that. But I try to give some guidelines around where some good fieldwork sites are. Always important to have a backup plan because, you know, sometimes things don't work out. So again, they're kind of learning this real world experience of what it's like to go out and do data collection and field work. And again, the whole point is to kind of fail, right? If you're going out of your comfort zone and you're giving it a try, it's a learning process. They need to have fun, and it's all about maybe not getting the best field notes the first time, but by reflecting on that and understanding what it's like when they're out there, they can understand what happened, why it happened, and what they would do differently next time. So it's a process, and focusing on that kind of reduces the anxiety for them. So this is sort of an overall outline of how I approach a formal classroom setting for teaching qualitative research. We start with ethics training, and these are generally not, by the way, IRB approved studies unless they came into the class with IRB approval and already working on a project. This is all just for classroom. So, but they do ethics training so they understand why there are certain sites they shouldn't choose. We talk a lot about how the researcher is the instrument, researcher reflexivity, and how we are doing the interpretation. I do approve the site description before I send them out into the world. I need to know where they're going and what they plan to do so nobody gets in over their head. Then we start with the document analysis. So, you know, how the documents and text is framing these spaces. And we do that alongside discourse and narrative analysis. And then we always do peer review to kind of create a learning community. Then we move into the observational field work and we learn about ethnography and case study alongside that, because that's a type of data that's common in those approaches, and do a peer review. Then we move into the interviews. Once they've done this field work and the document analysis, they know what they want to ask at that point. And we talk about grounded theory and phenomenology, just because those are methods that often use interview data. We do a peer review of the transcript. And then when we move into thematic analysis and representing findings, we talk a little bit about participatory designs and arts-based design. And then once they've done all of that, they're ready to learn about epistemological stance, because they've got something to hang that on, the role of theory and the literature review. And to me, you know, after about, I guess, 12 years of designing and teaching students in this way, using this model and refining it over the years, I found it to be really, really helpful to really have students experience in the field what it's like, you know, with all the pitfalls and rewards that come along with it. And so I will stop there, and I know we're taking questions later, but that was kind of my one little nugget of what I think is important when thinking about teaching in the classroom.
Thanks, Trina. And you've given us some good food for thought about not only kind of the ways to sequence the content, whether or not you're teaching qualitative or other methods, and the kind of role of the milieu, of getting, you know, outside of a comfortable milieu and then moving back into looking at the theory and some of those abstract ideas that people might have a hard time understanding, to begin with. So next we have Dr. Nicola Pallitt, and Nicola's research interests pertain to critical perspectives on educational technologies in higher education. In particular, Nicola's research focuses on online facilitation and networking, learning design, online professional development, teaching portfolios, student video projects, networked scholarship, and digital storytelling. Her curiosity-driven research area related to her PhD research is digital games, and she is one of the few game studies scholars in Africa. She is academic staff development practitioner in technology, enhanced teaching and learning specialist at Rhodes University, and she coordinates efforts of the Educational Technology Unit at Rhodes and offers professional development opportunities for academics to use technologies in their roles as researchers. So, Nicola, over to you.
Thank you, Janet. I hope you guys can hear me clearly. Is it all right, Janet?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I, for those who don't know, Rhodes University is in the Eastern Cape in South Africa. So I'm a novice supervisor. I'm just going to mention that up front. I'm not going to be claiming to be an expert, and I'm situating supervision in formal university studies where students are supervised for the purpose of completing a formal degree, so at a master's or a PhD level. At the moment, I have a master's in educational technology student that I supervised at UCT. So I was at UCT up until January this year, and he has just completed and passed his dissertation with distinction. And now at Rhodes, I have a new student doing a master's in higher education, and I'm also mentoring a PhD student enrolled in a pre-doc. So we have a pre-doctoral program where potential PhD students get support to think about what they would like to do for their PhD in higher education. And from there, that gives them the opportunity to complete a concept note that is used as part of their application for a PhD. So the supervision I'm doing is one-on-one. It's actually also mainly online. I'm not currently doing any group supervision, which I know is a popular model in other fields, especially the sciences. But I think what I'm going to be sharing today can be useful for those who are using different models of supervision as well. From conversations with senior colleagues, I've also learned that no matter how many students want to supervise, you're always on this journey towards becoming a better supervisor. So whether you regard yourself as a novice or an expert, we're always learning. Supervision is a two-way relationship between a supervisor and a student. So I'm going to be drawing on the work of Anne Lee to discuss dimensions of supervision and how supervisors and students can use her framework to reflect on their supervision relationship. While the title of today's webinar is Nurturing the Researchers of Tomorrow, I think we're also nurturing the supervisors of tomorrow. Supervision is a form of teaching. It is a pedagogy that students are enculturated into. And I think Trina illustrated that in her discussion as well. So it's not just about research in a discipline, it's also about ways of being a researcher and a supervisor. And it's important that we're aware of the different dimensions that contribute to this, whether you're a supervisor, a research student, or a future supervisor. So a while ago, my students and I did that webinar for the Emerge Africa Network about online supervision. And I told them to take the lead and to speak about their experiences. I didn't want to be the dominant voice in the conversation. And something that Heinrich actually said when he was speaking about the supervision journey really struck a chord with me. He said, I feel like a researcher. He's now writing papers and wants to do a PhD in the near future. But when he said, I feel like a researcher, I had an aha moment. And I thought, isn't that what we want to be working towards when we are supervising students? Isn't that what nurturing researchers of tomorrow should all, be about? And how do we get there? So as I mentioned, supervision is a two-way relationship. Yes, it's an academic activity. It's about growing knowledge in a field, but there's also a human element of this relationship that's so important, whether you're supervising online or face-to-face. You can't escape it. Okay, sorry, Janet, about the slides. Okay, next slide. So I started working at Rhodes University this year, took up a short course on strengthening postgraduate supervision, where I had to engage with literature on postgraduate supervision and reflect on my supervision practices. And that is where I encountered Lee's framework as part of the materials for that course. And there's some resources from the course on the postgraduate supervision website. So if you just Google strengthening postgraduate supervision, you'll find it. They're all licensed under a Creative Commons license. The course was offered more than 50 times at 23 South African universities. The course is voluntary, and I took it for my own professional development. Let's see, skip 2 slides ahead, please, Janet. Sorry, guys, I'm not seeing move slide on my screen.
Tell me which title do you want?
One about with the
dimensions?
drawing.
Yes, there you go.
Yeah. Okay, so that was about the course that I mentioned, and then the one with the next one is, yeah, that's the dimension of supervision that I encountered while taking that course. So this is a little sketch note that I put together, and it's a summary of the dimensions mentioned in the table from an article by Anne Lee in the South African Journal of Higher Education. It's from 2007, but I think it's still really relevant, and I can share the link to that article. But there are also other versions online. If you look up developing effective supervisors, concepts of research. The article focuses on concepts of supervision and how those conceptions of research that supervisors hold actually affect the way research students operate. The word dimensions and conceptions of research are used interchangeably, but I found it very useful as a tool to prompt my own reflection and to tease out, what are my beliefs about supervision? So Anne Lee has supervised many articles, book chapters, supervision, topics related to academic development and facilitation, which Janet has mentioned I'm also interested in. And she published a book called Successful Research Supervision, Advising Students Doing Research. And there's a second edition that came out this year. I want to emphasize, though, that there's no recipe for successful supervision, but practical frameworks like this can help us to reflect on our own supervision practices. We see a lot of books out there with titles that imply that there is a how-to for being a good supervisor or for being a good research student, but it's not the case. So let's start with the functional dimension. So supervisors who hold this model of supervision see their task as one of directing and project management. It's about managing expectations and allocating responsibilities. Not that this isn't important, it's often the first stage of many supervision relationships. For the student, it's about direction, moving through various tasks in a logical order. But the danger is that students need to go beyond organized obedience. And many of the instruction manual feeling books on supervision are often only engaging with that functional side of supervision. Then next, the enculturalization model is about the broader direction of the student. It's about becoming a member of an academic discipline. It involves conceptualizing research communities as communities of practice, where supervisors model ways of being in such communities, and engage students in apprenticeship. Enculturalization happens at various levels. So it could be into the institution, the community of the discipline, perhaps even a professional community or a profession in a particular country. And sometimes when you're supervising a student from another country, the language one uses to talk about things may differ. So supervisors have to enculturate students in terms of the language of the discipline, where it comes from, and how it may differ to how that language is used in our local contexts. So within culturalization, the supervisor makes decisions about when to open certain gates. And depending on what stage of research a student is in, you know, what to make available to the student. So it's about the research supervisor as a gatekeeper. You know, when do you share X book or encourage a student to present for Y conference? You know, these are the kinds of considerations that live in this dimension. This dimension is also about enculturating students into a kind of supervision as pedagogy. And there are cultural dimensions that supervisors and students need to be aware of that Lee mentions. So for example, she asks, you know, how does the supervisor overcome the problem of the student who expects to receive instructions and who believes that to do anything other than nod and agree with the supervisor is poor behavior? And another one is making an academic argument and what that means. So to argue is not about being rude. It's about weaving existing literature, taking a position, inserting your own voice as a student. And enculturation involves a particular can involve particular pedagogic strategies as well, such as skeleton sentences to structure a piece of writing. Okay, and then onto the critical thinking model. This is where the supervisor promotes inquiry and debate, problematizing, finding connections, and Lee notes that supervisors can opt to be gently Socratic or constructively critical. And there are various tools and questions that supervisors can use to aid critical thinking. So for example, you may ask a student, or if you're a student, your supervisor may ask you, what do you mean by, you know, X, perhaps testing for any ambiguity. Questions like, what assumptions are you making? However, Lee cautions that we also need to be aware that there are cultural differences in how critical thinking is developed. And rather than reading to be able to synthesize, some students want to read to discover what the sage is saying. So intense study of individual text rather than looking at similarities or dissimilarities between texts. By contrast, emancipation involves mentoring, supporting students in constructing knowledge, and the skills supervisors draw on here are facilitation, encouraging analysis and reflection that can lead a student to personal growth, and a reframing of knowledge. In this model, the supervisor should also encourage reflection. So the student should be able to say, I used to believe X and now I realize Y. And then lastly, relationship development requires supervisors and students to draw on emotional intelligence, having personal awareness, and being able to draw on experience. So this dimension is often implicit in how we communicate with our students or provide feedback. So the dimensions moving left to right have different balances and power. There's more student agency, for example, in the emancipatory model than the functional, for example. And these articles focus less on these, probably because they're really tricky and less associated with explicit pedagogic strategies. Okay, so something supervisors, you know, could be operating in different dimensions at the same time or in different ones at different times. Early on in the supervision relationship, you may be operating in the functional dimension, and then later on, you know, relationship building and emancipatory dimensions. So you can use these dimensions to ask yourself about what kind of supervisor you are, what kind of supervisor would you like to be. Perhaps you need to operate at X dimension more with a particular student. Maybe it's about seeing, you know, okay, not too sure about the pedagogic strategies to supervise in relation to a particular dimension. For students, it can help you think about your supervision relationship with your supervisor and the features thereof. Are there things that could be happening differently? In what ways is the relationship working or not working? So I'm going to show you, sorry, next slide, please, Janet, some quotes from some of my students that I think illustrate the different dimensions of supervision. It's not always too easy to unpack these. So if we look at the first one, it's about, the student feeling that she got direction. But there's slightly more than functional stuff going on here. So in which dimension would you locate this? For example, I just want to show that it can be really messy and there can be overlaps between dimensions. And that's okay, because it's still getting us to reflect on our practice. Even if we think back to the student of mine who said he feels like a researcher, this sounds like enculturation, being enculturated into a community of other researchers, but it's also quite emancipatory. Okay, so I'm going to skip the next slide because I see I'm not doing too well on time, and go to the last one, which is about how we can do it better. Yeah, so one more. Okay, so how can we learn more about the supervision relationship and get better at doing it? So there are pedagogical practices involved in supervision, and just as academics invest time in the professionalization of teaching, we should also be devoting time to becoming better supervisors. So I encourage fellow supervisors to invest time in our professional development as supervisors, whether it's reading a journal article on supervision or taking a course. We also need to have conversations with other supervisors, and these can be colleagues at our universities or beyond. We can engage in online spaces about supervision, share resources with other supervisors in our fields. For some of us, this may be happening already in formalized spaces, such as academic departments. But if it's not happening in your department, I really encourage you to look at spaces and networks where you can have those kinds of engagements. So going back to how can we do it better, we have to do it together in our relationships with our students, as well as part of a broader community of supervisors. The supervisors need to be active researchers and part of communities and networks. And supervisors may be mentors, but sometimes mentors need some mentoring themselves. And I'm part of the next research support group that Alice is going to be talking about. And it's through being enculturated into various mentoring experiences that we're also growing our toolbox to draw on, that we can bring out for our own supervision relationships with students. So I'm part of EarthSeas, which Alice is going to be talking about next, and I joined to get mentoring as an emerging researcher. And connecting to others allows me to learn more about mentoring by being mentored. So while my focus, I was focusing on supervision and mentoring in formal spaces, there's great value that one can gain from engaging in informal spaces, such as online spaces beyond one's institution. Yeah, so I really encourage you guys. Back to you, Janet.
Okay, and thank you, Nicola, and I hope that those on this webinar and those watching the recording will go to methodspace.com, where we are offering, lots of materials that, may be helpful as you're working to improve your supervision, and we will share links to the resources that Nicola mentioned. So next we have Dr. Alice Barlow-Zambodla. And Alice comes from a multidisciplinary background and has more than 24 years of research and lecturing experience in higher education, and more recently, 12 years of research and development experience in the nonprofit sector. She works with Conservation South Africa as a landscape director and I will not pronounce this correctly, so I will just skip that, but she works with with Conservation South Africa is a local affiliate of Conservation International, committed to helping rural communities adopt more sustainable approaches to development. Her role involves strategic planning and multi-sectoral stakeholder engagement, as well as management and oversight of CSA staff implementing community interventions. Alice also works part-time as a research support convener and network development consultant for the Emerge Africa Network. So over to you, Alice.
Hi, everybody, and greetings to you from East London in South Africa. Unlike Trina and Nicola, I'm going to talk to you about professional development in the more informal space. I'm going to be talking to you about a collaborative pilot initiative that I've been involved in over the past year that's been looking at how to support the professional development of a group of emerging EdTech researchers in the online space. And I just want to flag right up front that this is not something that I've had like special training in. It's kind of something that I have a passion for. I've always had a passion for professional development and supporting people to grow. Now, the initiative that we're working with is targeting emerging researchers, maybe people that have finished some postgraduate studies, maybe masters, PhDs, and postdocs who need to do more research and who need to publish research. And I know that the doing and the publishing of research after people have finished their studies sometimes is a challenge because some people have language issues, some people have challenges and are afraid of doing presentations and writing for publication. And on top of all of that, having completed their studies and maybe they're out in the workplace, there's usually limited access to ongoing support. They don't have the support that would help them to navigate or to transition into kind of research career pathways. So as one of the other co-facilitators on this program coined it, they need a critical friend to support, to motivate, to encourage, to inspire, and help them develop the confidence to publish, the confidence to engage more actively in research. So Emerge Africa is the network that I work with, formed an affiliation with the Association for Educational Communications and Technology in 2016. And both these networks are involved in the professional development of educational technology researchers and practitioners, with Emerge Africa having a more localized focus on educational technologists and researchers within higher education, with African higher education, whilst the AECT has a wider, more global audience. And through the affiliation, which also offered African EdTech practitioners sort of subsidized membership and access to a whole lot of resources that AECT does that a lot of people out here don't have. It was established that there was a need to provide support for the transition of emerging scholars into the global research space. And so Emerge Africa and AECT's Culture and Learning and Teaching Division embarked on an initiative to explore and pilot an online collaborative research support initiative facilitated by established researchers from both organizations. Can you change? Now, in terms of the project is referred to as the International Research Collaborative for Established and Emerging Scholars in Educational Technology, a real mouthful. But anyway, the purpose of this collaboration is to develop basically a research community of support, a research community of practice to support EdTech researchers and practitioner researchers. And some of the core values of the group of people that are working together is one, there's an openness and a willingness to share research. an understanding that we all come from different spaces, speak different languages, have different understandings, and the people that come into that space be sensitive to local contexts and show mutual respect. We also are looking at co-creating a space for participation of marginalized voices. A lot of the people that are participating in the program are marginalized in the sense that they don't feel confident, and many of them have not been able to speak in some of the spaces that they are being able to speak into now. We also seek to make it an encouraging and supportive environment. And in our interactions together, we look at exploring research dissemination in various formats, writing articles, making presentations, looking at the possibility of writing book chapters. And we also looking at growing open or networked scholarly practices among the participants. Now, Janet, could you change? In terms of the groups, we had a call was put out in 2018, and over 40 people responded to a call inviting them to be part of the collaboration. And we ended up with 21 people from eMERGE and 25 people from the AECT. And from this group of 46, 4 research groups were formed with about 10 individuals in each. And each of these groups focus on the following, well, not each of the groups. There are 4 groups. There's a group that focuses on access, equity, and quality in open distance learning. There's a group that looks at serving historically marginalized and underrepresented learners. There's another group that looks into culture in the instructional design process. And the 4th group looks into critical approaches in educational technology. And each group, each of these 4 groups is led by an eMERGE and an AECT facilitator. We won't go into the details of how the topics came to be chosen, but what did happen was that they tended to get chosen around some of the areas of expertise of the facilitators. In terms of the groups, what we discovered was that there was, having grouped people together based on their choices and their interests, we found that there was a lot of diversity within the groups. Multiple needs, multiple interests, multiple cultures, multiple expectations, which kind of made things a little bit complicated. We also had, being that we were operating in the online space, we needed to be able to communicate and collaborate effectively. And we had some resource challenges, especially challenges around access to specific resources and applications, and also bandwidth challenges. But you'll hear later on in the discussion how we overcame some of these. And then, of course, what we didn't kind of really engage with at the beginning, which we have learnt now, was the fact that we had people that were part of the group that came from more than 5 different time zones. In my group, the group has 5 different time zones, and that has been a real challenge for us in terms of operating. But in general, we have people that are on board working towards a common goal, and we've been really working hard at growing relationships, understanding that this is not an arranged marriage where things are set in stone and should happen in a particular way. It's still rather messy, is the term that I would use to describe it at this moment, but very interesting. Now, just for you to get a sense of some of the research interests and the diversity of the interests. This is a word cloud that I made from the Supporting Historically Underrepresented and Marginalized Learners group, where you can see that we've got things in common: the technology, the learning and teaching online, and interest in development, and so on and so forth. But some of the other stuff that's there in the tiny weeny letters are the particular interests that individuals had. So we had a lot of diversity and therefore a lot of different expectations and needs from that group. So what do? We give feedback and advice on work in progress, articles, book chapters, abstracts, presentations, and even on ethical clearance applications. We've had some very interesting interactions as we've tried to work with people with their IRB applications, which vary from place to place. We have discussions all about research ethics, eco-cultural issues, concepts, reaching consensus on the uses and understanding of various terminologies. It's been a really interesting one, working on collaborative research and then discovering that people have got different understandings of some of the terminologies just because of the language differences. We also do a lot of information and resource sharing among ourselves, with the people having stuff that people need and being happy to share it. And it gives opportunities for skills and knowledge sharing, as well as opportunities for catalyzing strategic linkages and creating opportunities for people to share what they know or what they're doing. Janet, can you change? So I think you heard the background noise when Nicola was talking to you just now. I just happen to know where she is. She was sitting at an airport waiting to catch a flight, but that didn't stop her from connecting to participate in this conversation. Now, this collaboration has been supported by the use of technology and a variety of strategies that individuals have implemented themselves to ensure they stay connected and participate. I mean, there have been challenges because of time zone, personal location at the time, bandwidth, and sometimes even access to electricity or particular applications. And sometimes people have participated by combining a number of different technologies that I often refer to as creating an Xerxes Internet of Things. In the slide that you're looking at, I was using my phone during a session with my partner, my co-facilitator, Christy, whose picture you see. And it was a Zoom session. And what happened was there was no electricity. And so I was using my phone as a mobile hotspot, but because there was no electricity and I needed to keep it charged, I had it linked in to an LED light so that it could stay on during the course of the event. And then I used my laptop to see shared screen content because my phone screen was too small. And Nicola could probably tell you a few stories about her own experiences in this regard. But the whole purpose of the collaboration is about establishing relationships that support, relationships that encourage, and what's happening is that we're having groups evolving very differently. It's very context specific, and so none of the 4 groups they've got some things in common, but every group is kind of developing along its own trajectory. But what we do have in common, and is being agreed upon, is that we determine a lot of what happens within the groups. We also have some rules of engagement. We've got a charter that was co-determined, And we also kind of try to be very clear about the relationships, boundaries, and what people's expectations can be, because there are so many different needs and so many different expectations. So you have to be very clear about what you can offer and what you can't. We're also working at meeting people where they are, and because a lot of the people in the groups are people that are working, they're working academics, they're working teachers, and with all the time zone differences and some of the connection challenges, we do understand that we can't expect everybody to participate all the time. And so some people are available, some people, and the levels of commitment change. In terms of the messiness, I've said that this has been a bit of a messy a process, but a very, very interesting one. And we've learned a lot in the process of implementing the pilot. It tended out being more complicated than we actually expected. The strategies being used, for example, in the group that I lead are still evolving, and they're trying to accommodate the diversity and the varying needs and work situations within the group. We know there's a need to foster common understandings, to support the formation of new linkages and relationships, as well as encouraging collaborative activities, whilst recognizing the need for individualized support. But however, despite the messiness, I can report that at least 2 individuals from this group have had research papers accepted for publication recently, and I'm confident that there will be more. And in conclusion, the pilot process is messy but evolving, and we're planning to do an evaluation and to have a look at the lessons learned across the board that will speak into future adaptive implementation. And we need to more clearly identify and strategically leverage existing synergies so that the 2 networks can continue to support emerging researchers.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank
I think this the values and the approaches you've described here can be an example that others can use when thinking about, how to encourage and support researchers who are already in the field. Now, we only have a few minutes left for questions, and Michael is going to share those with us. But don't despair. If your question is not answered, we will take the entire list and do the best that we can to answer them on methodspace.com in the next week or so, depending on how many there are. Michael, what do we have?
Yeah, I'm gonna combine kind of a thread that came up during Nicola's talk, and it broadly it's what about undergrads? So how can we apply these things, some of these concepts and some of the work and some of the effort to undergrad supervision? And then in addition, what are some of the organizations and or resources that might be available to people who are or have not reached kind of that postgraduate level?
Trina, do you have any suggestions for working with undergrads?
Well, I don't work with undergrads, so I don't have any personal experience with that. But I think a lot of, the approach in terms of classroom teaching, a lot of the idea of doing a fieldwork project is certainly doable at the undergrad level, kind of tailoring it a bit to, whatever the appropriate skill set and goals are of your particular students. But yeah, like I said, I mostly work with graduate students, so I don't know if one of the other presenters might have more to say about undergraduates.
Well, one of the things that I would suggest is to look for ways to incorporate research activities into the learning of the subject matter. So, for example, if you're studying a topic in the curriculum that, people in the local community or even their family members might have some experience with. Have them, formulate questions and do some informal interviews and then report back. Or if there are questions or topics where people within the class might have some experience, then questioning each other, working in dyads. To me, the important thing is to create that culture of inquiry. And there's a post on MethodSpace, and I'll kind of bring that forward so you can take a look at it. So that then when students reach the level of coursework that we've described, where they're actually going out and doing some field observations and having to ask other people questions, they have a sense about that and more confidence. And for those who are listening to this and thinking, well, we did emphasize qualitative, since Trina was teaching in a qualitative area. From my point of view, even with many forms, not every single form, but many forms of quantitative research, surveys, etc., we're also asking participants to answer questions. So, having the experience of working with real people and trying to, collect some data, even on an informal basis, I think will help people as they then start to think about more formal questioning of participants. What else do we have, Michael?
I think we've kind of run out of time. I wanted to mention that Kimberly from the audience mentioned the Council of Undergraduate Research. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and a special thank you to our guests, Janet, who's our methods guru, who we'll hear about again, and then Alice Barlow-Zambodla, who also was known as ABZ, Nicola Pallitt and Trena Paulus. And please note that 20% discount code UKRM20 for the two books by our guest today, Doing Qualitative Work Online by Janet and Digital Tools for Qualitative Research by Trina. And that code is valid through October 11th. We've had a couple people wondered if they could get the slides, and in the coming weeks, please be on the lookout for an email that includes a link to view the entire webinar and slides. And we'll also be trying to get to some of the questions that came in at the end. And there's some pretty good questions there that I hope we'll be able to address in future posts on methodspace.com, method, METHODSPACE.com. And please stay connected with us there for information about upcoming webinars, including Write a Book from Acquisition to Publication, scheduled for November 14th. That's all we have time for today. Thank you so very much, and goodbye.